So, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. This week with us we have Heather Meeker from OSS Capital, general partner at OSS Capital, who's going to help us navigate how the uh, financing and capital aspect of open source works. Thank you for joining us today, Heather.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Awesome. So, would you like to give us a quick introduction about yourself first?
Sure. I'm a lawyer and a venture capitalist, and in both respects, I specialize in open source software. I have been working as a lawyer in Silicon Valley for about 30 years. Before that time, once upon a time long ago, I was a computer programmer. It was
Oh,
so long ago that we called ourselves computer programmers instead of software engineers. And so all of my technical skills that I learned at the time are completely outdated. By the way, I learned to program in Fortran. Um, but I like to think that when I talk to engineers who are my clients or who are company founders for the venture capital firm, I feel their pain. I've I've stayed up all night trying to find a semicolon in the wrong place, and to me, that is the dividing line between programmers and non-programmers. But in any case, I'm very interested in software and have been interested in open source for decades now, and I have specialized in counseling people how to use it properly, how to use it in business, and in recent years, how to create businesses that are based on open source software.
no, that's a super interesting topic. So we have people on the podcast from many open source projects, large and small, and the problem of making either supporting your project by doing other work, getting contributions, making a business out of open source, etc. It's always present. SignalWire itself is a little bit born out of that because one of our founders is the founder of the FreeSwitch project, and we went into turning into a cloud service, for example, and we do have a support option, etc. But there are many large companies out there who just use FreeSwitch and don't even acknowledge the fact. Like, even if you tell explicitly no, like, guys, we actually know, they will deny it or just say, well, yeah. So I don't know
Yeah,
where we could get started. Yeah. So most often, the most important question I get asked here comes up the most often is, I have an open source project and I need to make it into a business. Where do people start from there? Because otherwise, I'm going to have to stop doing it or reduce my contributions.
right. And that's a very common question.
Yeah, it's
I
probably
think
where
the
it starts.
first the first question is really want to make it into a business because it is legitimate to have an open source project that's a hobby or a labor of love that you don't really want to monetize. And there are many people in the open source world who believe that's all open source should be. I, of course, don't agree with that. Right? I think open source is a great basis for businesses, but you need a strategy. It's really important to have a strategy. So I'm going to use an analogy. I hope this resonates with people. But on the show South Park, there was once an episode about the underpants gnomes. So like they had a three-step plan. Step one, collect underpants. Step two, question mark. Step three, profit. And
Awesome.
some sometimes, unfortunately, open source businesses seem to be kind of like that. Like step one, create an open source project, even get lots of stars on GitHub and create a lot of, buzz about your project. And then step three, profit, but they really don't know what's going to happen in the middle. So that's actually what I specialize in, is trying to get people from step one to step three. And there are various ways to do it. So I'm going to talk for a little while right now. I hope that's okay. Stop me if you
No, no,
want.
no, absolutely. That's
But
instructions are clear. I have bags full of underpants and no money yet. So
right, um, a project is not a product, right? And in a business you sell products. So and if you think about it, Most of your customers, they don't buy source code. Like source code is not a product. Okay. If you want to turn your project into a product, you have to think very carefully about what is creating value that people will pay you for. And there are many different options for doing this. All of them have to do with, there are different ways to articulate this in business. Some people call it a razor blades model, where you're giving one thing away and you're selling another. Some people call it an upsell model, but all open source businesses have this aspect that you're giving something away and you're selling something else. And I would also say we really believe this strongly at our VC fund. Open source businesses create an enormous amount of value, but they monetize only a small part of it. And that's the way it's supposed to be, right? That is this business model. But if you look at the broader business landscape today, you see that many businesses operate on this sort of upsell, freemium kind of models. And open source is really no different if you look at it from a very high level. So you have to think about, okay, what am I going to provide that no one else can provide? Because the open source code is available for anyone to use. And I hate to break it to people, but it doesn't matter which open source license you use, even if you use AGPL or GPL.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, you will not prevent people from freely using your code. There are some things they might have to comply with, but that is generally not enough to keep your competitors out of the business and create barriers to entry. So how do you create this upsell value that you're going to sell? Well, let's look at a few examples. Okay, so the one example that everyone looks at is Red Hat, right? Huge business, enormously successful, went public, got sold for many billions of dollars. So what do they actually sell? And if you ask most people, they would probably say, oh, they sell maintenance and support. But what I think they sell is quality control, because they have their own builds and they actually spend an enormous amount of effort on quality control. And their brand, Red Hat, what that means to people is that they can get that software and it's going to work right. Right. And that's what they're actually selling. And of course, they provide support, right? But what they're really doing is taking a huge platform of open source software, which is the Linux kernel, and creating a build of it and productizing it for their customers. And that productization is what they're selling. Now, people like to say there's only one Red Hat. When they say that in business, what they mean is that's a very hard model to reproduce, because look, Linux is the biggest open source project there ever was, and it is used by everyone in the world, and people, and like machines on other planets.
Oh, yeah.
and so not many other projects would support that kind of a model, because what they're doing is they're adding value, but they're adding like a tiny layer of value. Don't get me wrong, great company. It's just that they can make a business out of that because the project is so huge and so, prevalent all over the world. If you move into something even like infrastructure, database, things like that, or applications, the market gets smaller and smaller. And so providing the pure quality control aspect is a much more difficult basis for business. So there's that model, which is kind of the quintessential open source business model, but there are plenty of others. So for instance, there's the online services model. So let's look at WordPress. Okay, so you can download WordPress. I could download WordPress. We could run our own instance of WordPress. But personally, I go to WordPress.com. Okay, so why do I do that? I do it because I don't want to run my own instance of WordPress.
Yeah,
great product.
It's not super hard, but it's hard enough.
Well, it's hard enough so that people like me who, have other things they want to spend their time doing, will pay for that service. So that is really a pure like software as a service element that's being added to the software. And so That works really well for, say, applications for small and medium businesses, because then you've got a lot of people who don't want to run their own service, right? So, what you're adding there, of course, there's a quality control aspect, but there is also an aspect of actually making the service available to people. And so, that's a perfectly good business for some kinds of products. But you can see that that wouldn't work terribly well for, say, infrastructure software, because people would have a much bigger motivation to take it and run it on their own and save a lot of costs.
Right.
So so those are just a couple of examples. There are many other ways you can add value. You can sell hardware, you can sell professional services, you can sell all sorts of stuff along with open source. But if you take those two as kind of modal business models, what you see is that, particularly in the infrastructure area, there is this other model that emerged, which is usually called the open core model,
Mm.
because people, like a lot of companies, started creating infrastructure software. And by the way, open source is the only way to go for infrastructure software. We all know that already, right? Because it's just way better
Yeah,
than
yeah. There's
proprietary. So no need to discuss that for a long time. But your customers want to have access to the source code. They're sick and tired of vendor lock-in and source code escrows and stuff like that they have to deal with for proprietary vendors. So they want the source code, but how do you give that to them without giving away the store, right? That is a
mm,
really hard problem. So what most companies do is they have a hybrid model where they have a core that is open source, and then they have some other elements that are not open source. And those are sometimes sold as a service, sometimes as a proprietary license, and so forth. So that's what we call open core. And I have to say that most of the businesses that are interesting to me are in that area, because I love infrastructure software as a
mm.
sector. But that is an extremely effective business model, and you're seeing a lot of companies do very well in that area. So, just to sum it all up, you have to have a plan, and the plan has to be based on what your product is and what your customers are and everything. There's not just one plan that fits everybody, but you need a plan to get from your great project to an actual business, and it has to do with figuring out what people are actually willing to pay for.
Mm.
And it's not too hard to get them to pay for something, because, as I said, source code isn't a product. It doesn't solve people's problems the way products solve people's problems. And when you sell people products, you're basically selling them a solution to their problems.
That's really a good take. I feel like the open core model has been the most successful, even monetarily, because all of the open source projects that I'm seeing, even thriving, I mean, are really in two camps. One is open source project that's essentially backed by a company who is using it internally. And so you have all sort of contributions and dedicated team and whatever. First, which is one of them, honestly. Like since we started SignalWire, we have had more commits and more work on projects than on Friswitch than anything than before, because I mean, it's got people putting money into it. The other is the open core model. I can think of a few. I'm a Ruby programmer, and I can think of a few Ruby projects where they have this open core model that's working really well for them. I just wanted to touch back on another a side remark you made. So your licensing essentially doesn't matter.
Well, here's what I meant to say by that.
Richard Stallman, if you're watching, please turn off your computer now. Please.
If you go back 20 years or more, and there was this model that worked pretty well for some companies, which was called dual licensing.
Mhm.
So that
Yeah.
was pioneered by MySQL. And it was based on the premise that people who are creating commercial products would not want to be operating under GPL. And
Mm.
that makes sense because, if you go back to the distributed software model, you couldn't integrate like MySQL with a proprietary product and sell copies of it and still comply with the license that it was under, which was actually a variation of GPL. So over time, as the software industry moved to the cloud,
Mm.
that kind of broke that model, because in fact open source licenses allow people to do whatever they want with software they're not distributing. And so people who were using software in the cloud didn't have to share any source code or anything. And so there was really no incentive left for the commercial vendors to pay for an alternative license. And you're probably thinking right now, well, what about a Faro GPL? But that has not worked to discourage competition as well as some people hoped. By the way, that license was not written for the purposes of dual licensing, but it became pretty popular for dual licensing.
So
And
cloud software effectively broke open source licensing because you're
yeah,
no longer
yeah,
distributing anything.
it broke copyleft in a way, because the conditions for sharing the source code just got to be sort of less and less and less. But even AGPL doesn't really work to discourage competition very well, which is why you saw, I mean, I would say, and I think many people would agree with me, that the killer app for a Faro GPL was MongoDB. And
Yeah.
MongoDB abandoned the license because they didn't feel like it was serving their dual licensing model. Now, there are people out there who believe dual licensing is not the right thing to do in the first place and so forth. I don't comment on that because I'm a business strategist and not, and I'm not like coming from the aspect of you have to do open source only one way. I think
Yeah.
open source should be a big tent and everybody should be able to participate, whether they're business people or hobbyists or, just the kind of people who give stuff to the world.
Totally.
By the way, I should say, I put my hand up and say, for better or worse, that I counseled many of the companies that you have heard of who have done licensing changes,
Mhm.
like Mongo and Redis and Confluent and Elastic and so forth, in my capacity as a legal advisor. Because my area of expertise is open source licensing. So I've worked on a lot of those alternative licenses and helped businesses figure out, what bucket do we put the open source in, what software do we put in the open source bucket, what software do we put in other buckets, and trying to figure out a license mix that creates a sustainable business for them.
So you mentioned a company. I don't know if you allowed or you can't talk about that, but Elastic has
Mm-hmm.
been the talk of the town for a while when they made the license change, more than any others recently, I would say. There's another case that's mostly restricted to telephony, which is it's a change of licensing that happened to a PBX distribution of Linux that's interestingly called Elastics with an X.
I didn't know that.
What they pull, what Elastics did is a breach of licensing. They effectively did a bait and switch, but the Elastic case is a little bit more nuanced. Like I don't know how much you can say about that, but that to me that was interesting because it feels like they did the right thing, even if it angered a lot of people by saying you can do whatever you want, but you can't just resell our stuff because we're giving it away for free, which is the one sentence interpretation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll say what I can say about it. First of all, I was leading the drafting team for the Elastic 2.0 license, which is the one that you're mentioning. Elastic went through a couple of changes. They went from sort of an open core with a permissive license at the core of it, and then they did some changes, and then they ended up with a dual license model, which is either SSPL, which is Mongo's, the Mongo license that they wrote. And by the way, I led the drafting on that too, and the Elastic license. But I'll talk about the Elastic license a little because I think it's interesting. So just laying aside the sort of, there's a lot of churn about morality of this, and I just I'm not an expert on morality, so I won't discuss it, right? But the thing about the Elastic license is it is specifically designed to have the least number of restrictions necessary to preserve their business, and basically they're trying to preserve the business of providing managed services because they were, and you don't have to take this from me, you can see that their CEO has blogged about it and so forth, that they were very concerned about some of the big cloud providers, trading on their software for free and not contributing back to it. So that was an attempt to create an alternative model that wasn't quite open source, but that provided as many rights as possible to people, uh, but preserved one right to the company, which is to provide a managed service. I'm, of course, much simplifying what's in there, but I can assure you that we thought long and hard about how to do that. It was like, how do we give away the maximum we can give away and still preserve the business? And most companies who are doing these alternative models, that's the calculus they're making. They really do want to provide developers and users with all the rights they can, but they have to reserve something for themselves, and the open source licenses don't reserve any rights. That's just the definition of open source.
Yeah, there's I think again, I feel like the elastic solution from an external point of view, like without going into the nuances, is actually something that needed to be addressed. And I'm sort of glad they did it, because honestly, it's not often you have an open source software that can essentially be repackaged and sold without much in the way of changes. Like even Frizzwitch, which is a media server, you can't really just resell. I mean, you could resell Frizzwitch purely by, I don't know, selling hardware or whatever, but it's just the telephony part. So you still need screens to show how to control it, set up some kind of database, etc. Elastic was different in that it effectively works by itself, and you can just put a pricing in front of the API and just get it just get it going. So I feel like it's and what the last question on Elastic, how do they find out if someone is breaching that? Because that's sort of not super easy to. Is it inferential? Like, could they look at APIs and say, hey, these guys look like they're using our stuff? Because there's that's
you
still
know
hard, I suppose.
it's an interesting question. By the way, I don't know how they actually do it because I don't really do that work for them, but I'll tell you a couple things that might be of interest. Like, people, particularly people who are not technical people, have an assumption that it's very difficult to figure out whether someone's using your software. In fact, it's easier than most people think, precisely because of things like you mentioned, like, okay, if the software seems to be using these API calls or is behaving in this certain way, it probably is using this software. So there are footprints. Maybe they are a lot like footprints because you don't see the actual software that's being used,
Yeah.
but you see traces of it. And I don't know if you saw recently, there was a dust up over the Trump social media platform, and claims from the Mastodon project that they were using Mastodon software. And the people who had made that allegation, which I think obviously turned out to be true because the organization admitted it, they figured that out by looking at how the software is being provided. And it was basically a beta tested social media platform. So people didn't have direct access to the software, but they could figure out that it was being used. And
Yeah.
it's a little easier than non-technical people think, but you can't always figure it out for sure. But you can have what we would say in laws, like a good faith belief, which would be enough to bring a legal action or make a claim. So it's an art rather than a science, I guess, but it
Yeah.
is possible to do. And of course, you're going to leave stuff on the table. The whole premise, as I said, is like, when you've got something open source or even the source available kind of model, you are giving away a lot of stuff, and you're not going to go after
Yeah,
every
it is
violator.
out there. I mean, it's
Yeah,
yeah, the
that's just an assumption that you have to live with.
yeah, going with the API example that we made, you could actually wrap every single API call for Elastic into something else and just
Yeah.
have that layer translated it. But at some point, that's so much work that you probably deserve to keep using the platform. Like, whatever, you essentially rebuilt half of it just to make it look different. I suppose you
Well,
can.
and unfortunately, people are usually too lazy to do that. So,
Yeah, we're seeing there's an onslaught of sort of copycat connector apps. So those things like
Mhm.
there's a few where you can connect your SignalWare account to your that when you get a fax email, there's a bunch of them, and there's an onslaught of copycats that are probably based on a couple open source APIs that have been published in the past. And that's silly because they're really just copying even the documentation is they forget to change names. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's I mean I think that comes with the one last topic I'd like to touch, because maybe you can give us some. Say I have an open source project. I'm not really interested in monetizing it, but I'd like to at least get contributions back in code, especially from the larger players. Is there anything you can do other than the politely asking? I mean, I don't know. Of course, you can't force anyone, but is there a official channel you can go through to try and get some help?
Well, so first of all, if that's your objective, you would probably be using a license like a Faro GPL or GPL,
Yeah.
depending on the type of software. A Faro GPL for things that are likely to be used as SaaS, and GPL for things that are likely to be distributed software. So that will give you a certain amount of legal authority to demand that people share changes when they do
Hmm.
certain things. But beyond that, um, I'll say that, like, I've been working in this area for a long time, and I've represented a lot of big companies in open source matters. And most big companies, they want to play by the rules, and what's more, they even want to be good community members. Like, people assume that big companies just like don't care, but that's not actually true. They want to be good citizens too, particularly in open source community. And if want to, you don't have to believe me, there are some like logical reasons why. They
Yeah.
want to hire the best engineers, and the best engineers want to participate in open source because that's what engineers like to do. And also, it's good PR for the company, and a lot of the bigger companies are extremely serious about being good citizens in open source world. So if you think somebody is not sharing when they should be, or maybe even you just want to ask them to, even when they're not obligated to share, I would I would not make the assumption that it's a dispute. I
Mm.
would try to find the right people within the organization and say, hey, we would really love to have you as participants in our project, and we want to make room for you here. And the way to do that is to allow their participants from the company to meaningfully participate in your project. Maybe make one of them a committer and so forth. And that's the way to do it, is by community management. And I think you find that there's a lot of voluntary contributions that happen, particularly from the big companies. You just have to make sure that the people who are participating are going through the right channels within their company. um, but I rarely hear companies say, oh no, we don't want to share anything.
Hmm.
It's not really the attitude that they have, particularly the larger companies. So if you ask the right people, they'll usually play ball with you, and then you can always ask for a sponsorship, and people are sometimes willing to do that. There are also ways to, shall we say, pool sponsorship, like joining one of the foundations, like Linux Foundation. And then there's a company called Tidelift, which also pools resources to manage open source software. So there are some formal mechanisms, or you can just use the informal mechanism of, you know, making sure that you're including them in community activities.
I have to be honest. I think I only had one example of a large company not actually wanting to contribute or
Mhm.
even acknowledge usage of an open source project I was directly contributing to. But generally, yeah, that's a good point. I think at some point you have to go back to what you said a few minutes ago, which is you're giving something away, so it's some of it is bound to just go away, because then
Yeah.
if you want it to be fully commercial, you should have sold it, which is weird to say, but really it is what it is,
Well,
right?
it's a choice. I
Yeah.
mean, you don't have to monetize everything in your life, and we all make those choices, right? We do things for free, right? If we're good people, and the question is like, how do you do that and still sustain a career for yourself? And that's something you ask in every career, um, not just being a coder, but any kind of profession.
Well, yeah, that's I mean, so people keep contributing to open source. Come show up, come help. We're always happy to get some help. I've been contributing less because I've been doing so much with SignalWire between the opens within the podcast and other work I do as sort of solutions slash R&D things. But it's a great way to also learn. I keep saying this every time we have an open source specialist on the podcast. I try to wrap up by inviting everybody, even if you're not technical, even if you're not a programmer, as Heather has explained to us and showing us by being here, you can help in so many ways. So don't hesitate. Like, are you a community manager? Go ask if they need someone on their Discord or Slack channel. Are you someone who's good at marketing? Go ask if they need a web page. It's there. There's so many ways to help, and it's often actually I will say there's not often the technical resources that are missing, but it's the rest.
Yeah, like report bugs in a nice way.
Yeah.
Make feature requests in a nice way, because the people who are maintaining the project are working really hard. Like, if you give
Oh, yeah.
good feedback on bugs, that's hugely valuable. I mean, so, I don't write much code anymore, but I'm pretty good at reporting bugs, in a useful way, right? Not just like
Yeah, this doesn't work, fix it. Doesn't really help anyone. Well,
Yes,
we see that. Oh,
I did this and this happened and I don't think it was right, and here's a screenshot. I mean, that is like enormously valuable, and all you have to be is a user. You don't
yeah,
have to be a technical person to do that. I'll also add, like, most projects need help writing documentation, which is not something that is primarily done by coders. I mean, coders do it, but you
they
don't need to be
should.
a
They
you don't
should.
need to be a coder to do it. You can help with documentation. You can help with all sorts of things in open source if you and it's a good way if you're interested in getting into like technical skills. That's a good way to get your feet wet and understand what the process is like. I I actually believe personally that every person should learn to program even a little bit, because it's so important to understand how our world works. But you don't have to be some great coder, in order to add value. If you just like try to help make the project better, that's hugely valuable.
Yeah, there's again, yeah, there's a lot you can do. Is not just programming. Programmers should write documentation. But try to stub something out, and then they can get flashed out by better people at writing. But there's a it's super hard to
I
convince.
understand how that works, believe me.
Oh, I'm super guilty of that. Like my method documentation is usually one line, which does explain what it does. That's pretty much it. So I'm absolutely guilty of that. I have to admit. Great. So thank you, Adler, for joining us today. It was a great conversation. We don't often have, I would say non-technical, but we don't often have people speaking about different aspects of open source. So it was extremely interesting. Thank you so much.
Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you today. Thanks for inviting me.
And for the audience, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye bye.